Hi everyone, my name is Brian Hodge, and I'm here for Champion Briefs to do a video analysis of the 2014 March-April Lincoln-Douglas debate topic, which reads as follows. Resolved, placing political conditions on humanitarian aid to foreign countries is unjust. Now, in this topic analysis, I'm going to do a couple of things. The first thing that I'm going to do is examine the resolution from a descriptive standpoint in an attempt to figure out what the various and most important interpretational issues on the resolution are. Once that's finished, I'm going to spend some time talking about strategic considerations as well as potential affirmative and negative positions. Now, due to time constraints, I can only discuss a handful of these sorts of positions. That being said, I would strongly encourage any of you that are looking for a more in-depth examination of those strategic considerations to check out the March-April edition of this year's Champion Briefs. They are chock full of topic analyses that do an excellent job of delving into those strategic considerations very deeply. So, with that in mind, the first thing that I want to do is propose what I believe to be the most objective and reduced version of the resolution's central conflict. And the reason that I do this is to separate interpretational issues or vagaries or points where the resolution is not entirely clear, to separate ones of those that are caused by the wording of the resolution from ones that are caused by lack of clarity in the resolution's meaning or lack of sufficient information being provided to us by the resolution. So, the central question, the underlying question for the resolution that I would propose is as follows. Is it unjust for states to involve the affairs of governments with their endeavors at humanitarian aid? Now, while I do believe that this question is fairly clear, right, while I do believe that it's fairly easy to answer, it is undeniable that there are still problems with it that were present in the initial resolution as well. There are points that are not entirely clear. There are places where debaters are going to have to make arguments about how we should interpret the resolution's central question rather than it just being plainly obvious. And these are what we call interpretational issues, meaning that in order to answer the question of the resolution, these issues first require that debaters advance and defend some interpretation of how the resolution ought to be interpreted. So the first of these interpretational issues that I want to set forth is one that just about every LD debater should be very familiar with, and it comes from that word, unjust. So I don't want to spend too much time on this issue because, you know, this is supposed to be a topic-specific topic analysis. I don't want to get too much into framework, but suffice to say, the way that this particular vagary is usually resolved is by developing a framework that tells us what exactly is just, what exactly is unjust. However, on this topic, I would like to caution debaters against recycling that same old Kantian or deontological framework. In fact, on this particular topic, I think there are very compelling and very overwhelming reasons to believe that whatever normative orientation we decide on, whatever method of determining justice from injustice, has to have something to do with politics and political actors. And there are two reasons that I believe that to be the case. The first is one that I'm sure all of you have heard before, which is that the resolution is necessarily a question of state action. It's a question of states, of various political actors interacting with each other. And so it seems to make more sense, just on face, to have a moral framework that is oriented towards politics rather than towards individualistic moral actions. The second reason that I think this particular resolution should be oriented towards a political understanding of morality comes from the first word in the resolution, the word placing. That word indicates that the unspecified actor in the resolution, which is something that we'll get to in a second, is, by necessity, political in nature. So we don't know who the actor is, but we know that they are a political actor because only a political actor could engage in the action of placing political conditions on humanitarian aid. It is not just the consequences of that action that we are evaluating, right? That's not what we're being asked. We are being asked to evaluate the act of some political actor placing political conditions on humanitarian aid. And because of that, it seems necessary that our moral framework should be political in nature as well. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that individualistic moral frameworks are bad or that they are in no way applicable to this topic. I think there are very good reasons for why a Kantian or a deontological framework could apply to state actors. That being said, I think the onus, especially on this topic, is on the debater that is proposing the individualistic moral framework to justify why it can and why it should be applied to state actors and state actions when we already have other sorts of moral and normative frameworks that seem to be a lot more politically oriented. So that's the first interpretational issue that debaters are going to have to address, is whether or not their framework is politically oriented. The second interpretational issue that I want to investigate is one that I've already sort of touched upon, which is that the resolution doesn't explicitly give us an actor, right? We can make conjectures about who the actor would be given the way that these sorts of things usually go down in the international arena, but that's all still just conjecture, right? None of that is stemming from an actual textual resolutional source. Now, this lack of clarity not only problematizes things in the intuitive sense, right? Like it keeps debaters from reading plans, or at the very least it makes plans harder to read. It makes utilitarian positions a little bit more difficult to defend because it's not entirely clear who is taking what action. However, I think on this resolution, the question of who the actor is important on another level as well, because the question of the resolution's truth or falsity could actually stem from who the resolutional actor is. Now, this example that I'm about to present is admittedly just pushing an intuition, but I think it does demonstrate that it is conceptually possible that who the actor is in the resolution affects the answer to the resolutional question. Now, intuitively, we would all say that there is definitely a problem. It's definitely not just for a more developed state like the United States to levy its humanitarian aid against another state in order to extract some sort of political favor, right? That is sort of the central question of the resolution, and it is that scenario that makes us all sort of feel that the resolution is intuitively true, right? That being said, if we imagine for a second that the roles in that example are altered, and that it's not the U.S. levying its humanitarian aid over another country, but rather another country levying its humanitarian aid against the U.S. to try to change some political action that the U.S. is engaging in. If we imagine that that is the case, it is suddenly much less intuitively bad, especially if the actions that the U.S. or whatever more developed country is taking in this example are actions that we would actually condemn. So once again, this is all just pushing intuition. I'm certainly not claiming that the United States should have political conditions levied against it or anything like that. Instead, the point I'm trying to make is that it is conceptually possible for the resolution to be true given one understanding of who the actor is and false given some other understanding of who the actor is. And so what that means is that it's necessary, it's very important for debaters on both sides of the resolution to engage in this question, to give some answer to the question of who the resolutional actor is. So the third interpretational issue that I want to discuss is the phrase political conditions in the resolution. Now this is clearly an important phrase, right? It makes up and defines a large amount of the resolution's topic literature. But I think there's more space for interpretation in the phrase political conditions than a lot of people realize. For example, the intuitive interpretation of political conditions that comes to mind is that there is some more developed state, like the US, that currently gives humanitarian aid to some less developed state. And when that less developed state starts engaging in actions that we are not especially fond of, we tell them, look, if you want to keep receiving the same humanitarian aid, you're going to have to stop committing these actions. That acts as a political condition on our giving humanitarian aid to another state. Now already, even under this most intuitive interpretation, there is a concern that the interpretation is not entirely defensible. And this usually goes back to the idea that political conditions on humanitarian aid treat people as a means to an end, right? That they hold people responsible for things that they are not at all responsible for. Namely, that the people in the target country that have the ability to change these political actions are most likely not the same individuals that are going to be punished by our taking away of humanitarian aid, right? So there's a sense that we're punishing certain individuals for the acts of another individual or group of individuals. And that certainly is enough to leave a bad taste in our mouths, right? It's enough to make us feel that the actions we're taking are certainly not morally desirable. However, they're certainly still defensible, at least in certain instances, right? That's why there is at all negative topic literature on this topic. That's why there are negative solvency advocates that say, yeah, we may not like doing this, it may be unsavory, and yet we've used it in the past and it's worked well, and so we want to continue using it in the future. So while it may be true that this intuitive understanding of political conditions leaves a bad taste in our mouth, I don't think it's indefensible. However, what I would suggest is that the interpretation I've just explained is not actually rooted in the text of the resolution. Specifically, there's nothing in the text of the resolution that would indicate that the political conditions we're talking about have to exist in the target country rather than the donor country, right? The problem, the moral bad taste in our mouth comes from the fact that we are holding most likely the lowest echelons of the society of the target country responsible for the actions of the highest echelon, right? But this is an order of magnitude even further removed from that. This is some politician in the donor country using political conditions, using humanitarian aid as a political condition to change domestic policy in his own country, right? Using it to change something for which the individuals that are functionally being punished have absolutely nothing to do with, using it only as a domestic political tool. I would argue that this interpretation is just as justified by the text of the resolution as the first one that I discussed, and is vastly more indefensible. So my point here is that even when it comes to phrases in the resolution that don't seem like they have a lot of wiggle room, phrases that seem fairly set in stone, it's important to consider the way that those phrases can be twisted and turned to force you to defend something that you don't want to defend, right? It's very clear that the second interpretation that I suggested is functionally indefensible, and so the only thing to be done is to keep yourself from having to defend it in the first place. And as I've hopefully been emphasizing, the way to do that is by thinking about these interpretational issues and coming up with interpretations on these issues that you can defend in advance. So, the takeaway from this first section, from this discussion of interpretational issues of the resolution, is that these, as well as other interpretational issues, are ones that all of you are going to have to be concerned with, both in your positions and in round, right? And that means that when you're in a round and you're debating someone that doesn't give lip service to these questions, you need to be thinking during your prep time how you can exploit that strategic failure for your own strategic success. So, with that in mind, I now want to move on to a brief discussion of some strategic positions on both the affirmative and the negative for this resolution. So the first affirmative position that I want to suggest is a deontological one. This may seem strange given my earlier discussion of individualistic moral theories, but this should just go to show you that, like I said, I don't think all individualistic moral frameworks on this topic or on any topic are bad. Rather, I just think that this topic gives some good reasons for why our framework shouldn't be individualistic. However, if you are to do the work to justify an individualistic deontological moral framework, I think a deontological affirmative case on this topic is incredibly strategic, if only because the violation is so incredibly clear. And this goes back to the discussion that I was just having, which is that it involves treating someone as a means to an end, right? That's the intuitive reason as to why we all sort of feel like the resolution is true as soon as we hear it, right? That it just seems morally wrong for us to hold certain groups of people accountable for something that they have no accountability over, right? It necessarily involves using them as a means to an end. And I think that that is almost undisputably true about placing political conditions on humanitarian aid. And so what that means is that debaters that read a deontological affirmative case really only have to win the framework debate, because the offense under their framework is essentially a given. It's essentially just true, which means that if they win that deontology is the correct moral framework, they've essentially won the round, assuming there's no arguments in the negative that would take out deontology or something like that. So yeah, I think the deontology affirmative case is especially strategic because it really only requires you to win one particular aspect of your advocacy. The rest sort of just falls into place after that. So the second affirmative position that I want to discuss has to do with international law. And the gist of the position is that there are certain international law standards put forth by international institutions like the UN that say that humanitarian aid should not have political conditions attached to it. The reason that I think this affirmative case is so strategic stems from the short description that I've already given of it, right? Which is that at least one part of the syllogism of this case is entirely descriptive, i.e. the offense, which says that there exists some law somewhere that says the resolution is not the just action to take, right? That the resolutional action is against international law. Descriptive arguments are incredibly strategic because they require you, as the person justifying them, to do a lot less, right? It's more you pointing at something in the world and saying, look, that exists, right? Making claims about how things are rather than how things should be, which is a lot more complicated. That requires you to come up with some sense of what the ideal would be, right? Of how we want consequences to turn out, things like that. That's a lot more complex and obtuse than just saying, hey everyone, there's this thing that the UN made that exists that says we shouldn't place political conditions on humanitarian aid. Now, it's not just the offense of this position that lets you be descriptive either. It's also parts of the prescriptive framework. And this is why I find the position to be so strategic, is that most frameworks require you to make a series of prescriptive arguments to arrive at a prescriptive conclusion, i.e. that we should do what deontology tells us to do, or something like that, right? This framework lets you come to a prescriptive conclusion by making primarily descriptive arguments, right? The vast majority of the framework arguments that you make can be things like, well, the UN exists, we have collectively, as a world community, come to the conclusion that there are certain things that we should do, there are certain things that we shouldn't do, right? And placing political conditions on humanitarian aid falls into the latter category. Note, you still have to make prescriptive claims under this interpretation, i.e., most importantly, the prescriptive claim that we should do as international law tells us to do. However, this severely mitigates the number and the quality of prescriptive claims that you have to make and lets you spend most of your time making descriptive arguments, which I find to be vastly more strategic. Now, the last thing I want to do is very briefly touch on a potential negative position. Unfortunately, the negative on this topic attributes the short end of the stick, but I do think there is one very stock, very common negative position that is very strategic, and it's the one that Michael Fried actually endorses in his topic analysis, which is a realism NC. The primary reason I think this is strategic is because, well, the first reason is that we all just sort of intuitively get the feeling that the resolution is true, right? That it is probably unjust for us to put political conditions on humanitarian aid. But this is strategic because it lets you get out of that intuitive definition of justice and injustice, right? It lets you make things, or it lets you make claims like justice is socially constructed, which means that it's impossible, it's functionally impossible for states to take actions that we would consider to be unjust because states themselves are the ones that decide what is just or unjust. This is a central tenet of realism, right? That we cannot condemn states for taking actions that would be in their own best interests. And so, while the affirmative is going to be making a lot of arguments for why the resolutional action is necessarily unjust, you circumvent those arguments by simply challenging their definition of what constitutes justice in a very fundamental way. The second reason that I think a realism NC is especially strategic is that it's not utilitarianism. And I personally don't think utilitarianism is the most strategic NC on this topic, at the very least because in my own research I haven't really found any good solvency evidence. The vast majority of individuals that are actually policy advocates that are writing on the topic say that putting political conditions on humanitarian aid almost never works, and in fact tends to make things worse. And so I think realism offers a promising potential negative position on the topic that is stock enough for you to read it in front of the vast majority of your judges, but it's also strategic enough that you're not going to be hitting people's 1 million argument long utilitarianism plots. So thanks a lot, guys. I hope you found this helpful, and good luck to everyone on this topic.